Thank you very much. That is in my warning set in a minute, but you will be aware this is recorded now. So I'd like to welcome you to the NanoHarmony workshop for the summer. We're going to go through learning some lessons from the past and trying to work out what our customers are at each of the steps in an OECD standards process. So first working out how you get through the defining of what a standard should be, or whether it's a technical guidance document or a test guideline, and then go through to looking at each of the steps and each of the customers or actors that a person would have to interact with as it moves through the process. If you go to the next slide, Sean, you can see the agenda. So first we'll have Frank von der Kammer from Vienna give us a talk about the trials and tribulations of getting from the science idea to the final accepted test guideline guidance document. Ma from the OECD will then go through a checklist of what you need to get through the OECD processes successfully, seen from her side as the OECD lead. And then Catherine Doris from UBA will describe a kind of hybrid role of sitting on the fence, trying to be the person who leads through a technical development, a technical guidance document into its development, and what experiences there are there from getting the information you need from the different actors and dealing with the feedback. Eric will then describe kind of a third role, so the person that accompanies a test guideline from the commenting round of a regulatory expert. And then we'll hopefully have time at the end for some questions and answers. Just as housekeeping, we'll expect everybody to have themselves muted and probably keep your cameras off unless you're speaking. We might see if there's time for a picture at the end if we get there. And then just ask questions in the chat. That keeps a nice order of where they are. We'll try and get to them at the end of each talk, but also can keep bigger things for the end if we need to. Do note that it's being recorded. You'll be sent a link to it afterwards, but we will also hopefully be able to put it on the website. So you've been warned in case you want to keep your cameras off and watch what you say. And then there'll be a Mentimeter running in the background behind with some stops in between, and Sean will go through them in a minute. Next slide, please, Sean. So do you want to take over for a bit there, Sean, in terms of how this will run?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Thank you ever so much, Klaus. So we're going to start with just asking people just a few questions. So I presume a lot of you are familiar with Mentimeter now. So if you just go to menti.com and input the code, or if you go into the chat, I've just put the direct link in there to the actual Mentimeter. So if you just go to the Mentimeter, put the code in, either on the laptop you're on or the device you're on, or on a separate device such as a mobile phone, and you'll be able to answer some of the questions. We've got a few questions at the start and then just one that will be sort of at the end of the presentations. So I'll just start by launching the first question now, which is, which category best describes you and your relationship with test guidelines?
Yeah. So we should be getting 53 in the corner, Sean, if everybody gets it.
So we'll just leave this running for just a few more seconds. And sort of obviously, if anyone's having any problems with the Mentimeter, if they just sort of let us know, we can try and make sure that everyone's able to access it. So just moving on to the next question. What level of direct experience have you had with the OECD test guidance program? And that's from none to very little, intermittent or constant.
Good. Well, that looks like there should be a nice forum for learning a lot here today. There's people that don't know much and people that should know a lot.
And so just a few more seconds on this. And then just moving on to the next question. Based on your own experiences, would you say that the test guidelines or guidance document process is ranging from far too slow and needs to be sped up, slightly too slow, could be a little faster, works at the right speed, or do you think that test guidelines are currently introduced too quickly and the process should be slower to allow sufficient time for studies to be completed?
I like the way you are stopping the unconscious bias here, Sean.
To be honest with you, class, all of the questions should have been hidden. I don't know why Mentimeter's changed the setting on it, but do you want to leave this result till the end, Klaus?
Yeah, I think that might be interesting. And then you're planning on stopping at the end for the remaining questions, or in between each talk?
It's just stopping right at the end, Klaus. We can reveal some of the answers, such as this one, and then the sort of final question.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave this question on for just a few more seconds for those who haven't answered yet. And so then the final set of questions is, do you agree or disagree with the following statements? And you've got a range of levels of disagreement or agreement. And again, we'll leave this one hidden until the sort of end, but I'll leave people a few seconds to fill this one in, because I know there's sort of multiple statements here that you need to click to show your level of agreement. And then Klaus, this is the last question in this set, so I can leave this one up and people can come back and carry on filling this in whilst the presentations are going on if they want.
Yep. Okay. Sorry, I'm still doing it. Good. Okay. So Sean will stop us when we need to engage with Mentimeter again. And I also went straight in without really introducing what NanoHarmony is, because we've had so many workshops now. But if you are new to NanoHarmony, I suggest you go to the website. There's a couple of introductory talks recorded there by Thomas Coolbush, introducing the project. But really it is about generating networks and contacts between the people that are engaged in all levels at the generation of standards, mainly focused on OECD standards, and making the process as smooth as we can. A man that knows both where it can be smooth and where it wasn't smooth is Frank. So if you want to share your screen, Frank, we might as well get straight to the meat. Perfect. And I'll try and nudge you to time if it goes over the agreed time. Okay. All yours, Frank.
Thanks, Klaus. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon to this NanoHarmony workshop. I would like to guide you through what happened to us during all the years that we were somehow engaged in science and trying to get our science into usable guidelines and guidance documents. And my group at the University of Vienna was probably part of the European and also OECD level risk assessment from the early beginnings. And for me, especially as a simple environmental scientist, it was really the first step to understand what is OECD actually doing apart from what we get through the media. So it wasn't a organization that was well known to me. And also I had to learn many new vocabularies. I can think very much about a situation in the beginning where I was asking, what the heck is an endpoint? So I would like to give you the idea and what happened during all the years, and I hope you enjoy that. So just very brief in a nutshell about the processes that we are seeing on these developments. Actually, Ma will give you much more detail on this and probably also tell me if I'm saying something wrong. So in principle, you have, of course, your scientific background. You might gather it from your own experience, from literature, or you still need to develop that. And especially for nano, that was really necessary because there was not much available in terms of knowledge in the early days of this nano risk assessment activities. And then actually, when there's an interest in producing a new guideline or a new guidance document, you need a lead country actually that adopts and proposes such an activity and creates the so-called standard project submission form. Also took me some time to find out what this SPSF actually is. And then actually the WNT accepts the SPSF, and then you can start with the development. Of course, you need some funding for that. And this is mainly about condensing your complex, comprehensive science into something that is actually in the end really doable and reproducible. And still, even trying to condensing it, to simplifying it, you must keep some realism so that you have also a relevance with that guideline that you are producing. Yeah, then you actually start the activity. So you have all your things together. You did your experiments. You try to draft your guideline. You're always talking with your expert group that is part of your activity, the OECD expert group that is actually helping you to develop your concepts. And actually then you have to do a validation, of course, for a guideline, because this actually is a basic requirement for a guideline that it shows its reproducibility across different labs. And then actually you submit your draft to the WNT, and then you have an iterative process of commenting rounds where the experts of the OECD from the different countries actually give your feedback and criticize your approach or help you in some things that are still unclear. And this is iterative until acceptance, or actually probably also in the one or the other process leads to failure and not acceptance of the activity. And then in the end, it's adopted. In our case, actually, the TG 318 on nanoparticle dispersion stability in environmental media, it was not the only activity. There were 3 things actually planned, also a guideline about dissolution of nanomaterials and an accompanying guidance document that should help in preparation and interpretation of the data that are produced by these 2 guidelines. So we had somehow develop our scientific background. We had to standardize the experimental setup. We had to find the media compositions that were right. What kind of parameters do we set here, and what is the resolution of our determined parameters in the end, the endpoint? The time frame, the sampling and sample preservation, and of course, all the possible analysis options that were available. And that was, of course, relatively complex. So we went into the development where actually it was reducing. So just put it to the main and most important thing. all the experiments, the parameters, the time requirements, can we use in silico models, and so on. And also, can we use the most simple possible analysis and still keep our realism? The problem here actually was that we had two guidelines interlinked, the dissolution and the dispersion stability. And there was some delay on the side of the dispersion, on the dissolution guideline. And since the guidance document should actually contain both guidelines, also, of course, the input in the guidance document was delayed. That was actually finally solved, and the guidance document was prepared and also adopted in 2020. But with three years delay to the dispersion guideline, and the dissolution guideline is still going on. So that was a little bit the problem. And also what we saw as a university institute was, of course, that actually all the commenting rounds that came in on our guideline was, of course, outside our funded project. And that on one hand makes sense because it is a very dilute activity. It just happens every few months, but then actually relatively intense. In our case, we received 45 pages of comments on a 9-page guideline. And that is some work that has not been foreseen actually, and is not easily implemented in a running external funded lab. Okay, so how did it start? It actually started really early. In 2008, Austria supported the TiO2 in the OECD sponsorship program, so that became an interesting material for further research also in our lab. Then we actually proposed to the Austrian EPA for studying the agglomeration systematically of titanium dioxide, and we got a proposal funded the year after with a relatively small amount of money in 1 year, and there was also no continuation, but we could actually really build some of the basics that actually also then fueled the guideline development later. I gave a presentation in January 2011 to the expert workshop in Paris. And after this, there was a bit silence. And actually, I thought that probably the activities have been halted, or there's not an interest in this kind of behavior of nanomaterials in the environment. But in fact, actually, there was a lot of activity in the background to bring projects on the way for studying this in more detail. And then actually in 2013, there was an expert meeting on manufactured nanomaterial, environmental fate, and ecotoxicology in Berlin, where there were a lot of discussions of what actually, what is usable from existing guidelines, what has to be adapted, and what has probably to be produced new. And from this actually, at least on our side, there were 3 standard project submission forms for 2 guidelines, actually on the dispersion stability, on the dissolution, and also for the guidance document then issued and accepted. Very, very luckily, in late 2013, actually, there was a project for us funded by the German Ministry for the Environment and the Environmental Protection Agency for this dispersion stability testing and to bring it into a guideline. So that's to start now, how to quantify agglomeration in natural waters with a very simple assay. When you know about the complexity of environmental chemistry, water chemistry, particle reactions in the natural environment, this is something where you would say, oh my God, almost impossible. But what we had to do actually was looking into what are actually really the reactions that take place and that can be actually represented in the lab, and build a model out of this to get to our functional assay. A model. We need a model. So we have the reality. It's complex and here also quite cute. And from this, actually, we have to first simplify the whole thing. And that is already more easy to describe what we see here. It's just black and white, and the shapes are well defined and so on. But this is still too much for actually, in the end, going into a simple laboratory assay. And then you have your model. It still actually represents the shape. It should actually cover the main characteristics of the object, of the question, and also produce usable outcomes. If you're unlucky, then there are some other things coming in, like external pressure in terms of cost and time constraints, and then you might actually get into a problem. And I think this is one of the really critical steps here, that you really have to know what is the minimum that you really have to produce, and also defend this and to remain actually with this best possible option that you think is. And this is a long discussion, and I like these discussions that we had in the expert meetings, and that helped a lot to refine and to specify our experimental approaches and measurements in the end. Okay, very quickly, we had the very complex water chemistry. There's so much in that plays a role in agglomeration and that doesn't play a role in agglomeration. So we had to just take this apart, debunk this reactor. We also had to get to know what is out there, which concentrations play a role, what is the concentration parameter range in terms of water chemistry in a continental scale, for example. And also we had to say what we won't do because we haven't it fully understood, or it is not possible to represent this currently in the lab, for example, the variation of natural organic matter in the environment, and also the heteroagglomeration that wasn't possible at that stage in 2013. We selected the relevant water chemistry that actually plays a role in interactions of particles, and from this actually we got those out that have either the relevant concentration in the environment and also have a real impact on aggregation. That's the reason, for example, why sodium is kicked out. And also iron and aluminium are kicked out. Sodium because it's not effective, and iron and aluminium because they have low concentrations. And then you end up with your selected water chemistry for the tests. Then you have to find out the parameter ranges. You use databases for that actually, and get your parameter ranges and take from this your 95% coverage whatsoever. It's a decision that you make. And this actually defines then the concentrations of, or the concentration ranges of your test. You then actually go into checking your whole system, and most probably and best from different angles and different approaches. And this was a publication from Hamnes and Hasselöf in Sweden, where they actually calculated on basis on the water chemistry over Europe, these 800 something samples that are available. They estimated the interaction potential of particles for agglomeration, and the red ones are highly stable and the black ones are unstable. And they based this on calculation of 8 ions and used pure electrostatics here. And we did it in an experiment with gold nanoparticles. We used a varying water chemistry as we planned it for the TG. And we varied calcium concentration and the pH. And you see actually that it is a very similar picture. So from the experimental side and from the calculation side, we are ending up in a very, very similar picture. And that was something really good to find out here. Unfortunately, if you're kicking in natural organic matter into this system, what is not possible on the calculation side here, what is possible on the experimental side, then it looks like that. So particles are all over the place stable. Only in Monaco, actually gold is aggregating in Monaco according to our experiments here. And we know from reality that actually gold is agglomerating in Monaco. So it seems to be very true, but it also shows us that correlation is not always causality. We also then took various natural samples and compared, actually we measured the water chemistry in the samples we selected, our combination of water chemistry that could represent these samples in a very simple way, only considering a maximum of 4 ions here. And the results actually show that we are, from our test results to the real water agglomeration results, we are in a really good resulting here in very close results between the test and the reality. Next actually was the question, now how should the test look like? We would disperse them, we would let them aggregate for a certain time, we would let them settle, and then we take the cypinatin out of that, and we do this for several combinations of water chemistry. We did this on 4 different titanium dioxide materials with a very high parameter resolution. So this is the pH and this is the calcium concentration, 6 different calcium concentrations, 7 different pHs. And this is of course too much for a test guideline, especially when you consider replicates. So we thought about, could we actually reduce this in resolution and still remain with a valuable output? And actually, yes, in a 3-to-3 matrix, when you see that here, I toggle it, you see actually that the results are meaningful and still contain the information you want. So you can reduce this to a smaller set. So that was actually what it made, and we then actually had to do all the experiments with different nanomaterials and also the validation round and so on. in principle, we have the set of 9 different conditions. We have 2 different time points for a quick test, and then actually 6 different time points for a more intensive testing, where you also get the agglomeration behavior over time and can get some information from it. You see here that there are different pHs. This was the pH that we developed the test on, because that covers about 95% of the natural variation. There was a request very late in the end before submitting the guideline that actually asked for standardization or for harmonization with other guidelines, and we therefore changed the pH then later on. In 2013, the project started. In 2014, we had our first expert workshop with the experts from the OECD and external experts invited. In 2015, the next one, and then in 2015, in September, the expert meeting for the final draft. So we had 3 expert meetings, and I can just say, do this, talk frequently to your expert group that you create in the beginning of the project. That really helps. Not only in shaping your testing, shaping your guideline, but also in getting understanding, because some of the experts might actually later on comment your developments, and that's really helpful when they already get a draft that they know. Then we had our first commenting round, and we received the responses that were, as I said, 40 pages. A lot of things to do. We sent in the revised draft for the second commenting round. We again got some comments, some repetitive comments. That is a small problem here, and that is actually when you have other nationalities, other nations actually joining in the second round that haven't been there in the first round, you might have to answer the same or very similar questions again in the second round. We got the revision, we got the approval, and the 318 went public in 2017. So to conclude, we have some barriers in the beginning. These are the procedures of the OECD that are most people unknown. We have a language difference between research and stakeholders. That is something we really have to work ourselves in as scientists. And for us as scientists, the responsibilities are not always really known. So what is the national contact point doing? Who's the team of the leading country that is helping with all the procedures? Who's the contact point at the OECD for me to ask for, and so on. Then, of course, funding is really relevant, as you might think. Then the decisions on the complexity versus relevance and possibility of implementation, contradicting requests. You get comments that say the whole thing is much too complex and much too expensive, but you still have to consider this and this and this and this reaction. Not really possible in many cases to expand the testing and make it cheaper. It is a limited publication output. A TG for me as a scientist doesn't count. My university doesn't take this as a productive activity because it's not a reviewed paper. And that is something that we always have to explain. We are putting a lot of work in, and we probably have not many scientific papers because a lot of things are concerned with reproducibility and something that you usually can't publish. For a good practice, abandon from the beginning the idea to produce the best possible essay that covers all and everything that you and your colleagues know. Seek for the strong support of your national team. Thanks to my national team in Dessau, that was always really great. And from your national contact points. Include the experts of the OECD panels really from the beginning and intensively. Seek for a well distribution of experts from many countries, but also take experts, if they are available, take experts from external into your expert group. In the end, it's a collaborative process. It is not that you're driving your TG alone through the whole process. It's a collaborative process between you, your lead country, your expert group in the OECD, your external experts. In the end, it should be a compromise where all the stakeholders like industry, regulators, scientists, and so on can actually agree on. And the last thing from the last year, meet more frequently and online, because that is so easy now. And this is probably one of the best Corona lessons for me in terms of preparing my future guidelines. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm looking forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Frank. That was nicely illustrative. And I especially like the meet more frequently now we can. I think that does make it progress faster.
It makes it so more simple.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
There's no questions at the minute in the chat, but we haven't got that many people that we couldn't take a question live if somebody has one. Are there any immediate questions? Just open your mic and speak. Otherwise, it'll bring us nicely back on time and we'll take the questions. Okay, there's one from Rachel. Do you want to just speak out, Rachel, or do you want me to read it out?
Hi, thanks. I was just wondering if Frank had any advice on when to go from WPMN to WNT, because they're slightly different environments. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
You're muted, Frank.
These are totally different environments. The point is, if as soon as you have an agreement on WPNM level and with your lead country and your scientists involved on developing such a guideline, then actually you're filing your SPSF. And if that is then discussed and accepted, then you're mainly moving into the WNT process. But Mar might probably be able to say something to it. Mar, you're muted.
Yes, sorry, I have some background noise at home. So yes, I think that's a very good question, Rachel. I think for those that are not familiar with the OECD, just to clarify that one is the Working Party on Manufactured Nanomaterials, and the other one is the WNT is really like the national coordinators that are responsible for the approval of test guidelines. So they are the ultimate OECD body that will be agreeing with the declassification or the approval of a test guideline, okay? We have the Working Party on Manufactured Nanomaterial is more like an advisory committee in regards to test guidelines and guidance documents. So you will have all the experts, the scientific background there to help you to go to a smoother process when you land in the WNT. We try to encourage that when you start in a WPMN process, you already start involving your national coordinator from the WNT. So you make sure that the process is well known in advance, that you can get the different countries supporting your proposal, because that is just going to make it easier at the WNT. The WNT relies a lot in experts from the WPMN when it comes to science, for example. So this is something that, so in terms of when to go from the WPMN to the WNT, my suggestion is the WPMN is telling you that your project proposal is not ready, then my suggestion will be to wait. There's no harm in continuing the work between the WPMN. It's just going to make it smoother by the time you land in the WNT. I don't know if that answered your question, Rachel.
Thanks, that's very full. Thanks, Mar, and thanks, Frank. Great talk.
Yeah. Thank you. Any further questions before we hand over to Mar? Well, I'm sure we'll get back to them later. Thank you very much. That was, as Rachel said, a great talk to start on. Mar, do you want to share your screen?
Yep.
And give us our checklist.
Is it okay there?
That's perfect. Thank you. All yours.
So thank you so much. So I have a shorter presentation, but you will have two other presentations after me, and I think the fourth will complement each other quite well. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you will be less scared about going to the OECD with the test guidelines, and you will understand a little bit more about the background or what is in the back of the heads of national coordinators when they are reviewing the proposal that you are making. So of course, this now doesn't change. It worked just now. next, let's see if like this. Okay.
Yeah.
So you will see this slide several times because I actually stole it from our colleagues, Catherine and Doris, who will be speaking at the end today. But I thought it really summarized very well where we are at OECD, what are the different components for test guidelines or a guidance document development. So you will have science, you will have regulation, you will have countries that will be the ones that are proposing different project proposal. And then we are kind of like the recipient, if you want, of this proposal and this triangulation at OECD. We really want to try to oversee and give direction from the viewpoint of the regulatory applicability of the methods that is being proposed. So something to remember, and as Frank already mentioned it, some of the struggles that you will have is that not all science will be published and used in regulations. So what we're trying to make sure is that we can like clean, if you want, a little bit the science, which can be extremely frustrating for experts. And I take that, that as an important point. And it's really about how you create a common way of understanding among different regulations, and how can you develop tools that can enable the decision-making by individual jurisdictions, okay? So something to note is really that the OECD is not the deciding, we're not deciding on the regulatory requirements that your different countries have, but we're trying to assist countries in developing tools that are of common agreements and that can help the implementation of all the regulations for all member countries at OECD. And for that, I really like the sentence that Frank mentioned, that is really to try to put science into something doable, but for all, okay? So we have many test guidelines at OECD. So we have around 150 test guidelines that are constantly being updated. So something to keep in mind. And as I mentioned, they respond to regulatory need for several countries. So in the case of Europe, I don't know if you are all Europeans in the audience, but in the case of Europe, perhaps you're really trying to address the requirements from REACH, but you have to understand that we have many other countries within the OECD, and we have other calls, the mutual acceptance of data adherence, which is a legally binding agreement at OECD. And that includes countries such as Argentina, Brazil, India, Malaysia, Singapore, South Africa, and Thailand. So the legislation is going to be quite different and we have to make sure that the tools that we develop responds to all of their needs. So in this sense, it can happen that, and what Frank mentioned, which is very true, you have to simplify to a point where when the test method that you are proposing is giving you sufficient guidance for you to implement it, but at the same time, it doesn't cause any conflict if you want to use it by different delegations. The mutual acceptance of data is something that is particularly important for industry, because that means that if you follow, if you test following a test guidelines and you go through the good laboratory practice, which is a standard, if you want, a quality standard that we have at OECD for the adherence, that means that industry will only do the test once. And then that test is going to be accepted by all the countries that belong to OECD and to the MAD adherence. That means that a country, for example, if you do one test in Brazil, you can present the same test in Brazil and the same test in Singapore and the same test in France or in same test in the UK. It doesn't mean that the country will approve it, because that will depend on the country's regulatory requirements, but it means that you, as industry, you don't have to repeat the test, which we know that is quite costly. So the experts that are going to be providing inputs in this iterative process that Frank mentions will come from member countries, for example, regulators, from academia. They will also come from animal welfare organizations, and you will also have industry representatives. And we have to find a way to communicate and to find a consensus amongst all these participants. So the famous SPSF, the famous SPSF is the standard project submission form. It's a jargon that we use at OECD. It's very internal, but something to keep in mind if you wish to submit a project proposal at OECD. It's, for me, you really should understand this as a kind of contract. I mean, you have to explain in this document what is the scope, what is the purpose, what is the use of the test that you are proposing, and what are the limitations. Are you using this is only for nanomaterials? And if it's only for nanomaterials, which nanomaterials? This is extremely important because this is going to be used as the framework, and it's going to be your, let's say, like your kind of protective contract when you go through the expert commenting rounds and the process that will come along in the coming 1, 2, or 3 years or more, depending on how mature is your science. You have to explain whether you are doing this to address animal welfare or if you are improving an existing methods. It's important to address, to make sure that the maturity of science is there, because this is part of one of the struggles that you will have, which is the OECD is not going to be like a research project. You have to have the research already there. You have to have publications, sufficient publications to make sure that there is some maturity there and that you're not starting a research from scratches, because then it's not going to be approved. You also have to think that the method that you are proposed is robust and reliable for governments to make their decisions. So that's really important. That is mindful of the economical implication of testing, okay? And also that it has to be broadly accessible for all. So if you have a method that can only be performed in a single lab, then the method is not going to be encouraged within the OECD. You will have to wait until that method it can be applied or it can be tested in different laboratories before you can bring it to the OECD. Okay. So perhaps something that for me is quite something to keep in mind when you're trying to make a proposal is that you have the end product that you are proposing at OECD is really to allow regulators to do their jobs. So you have to make sure that you have regulatory and scientific acceptance, okay? So to have a regulatory acceptance, you also have to have a clear regulatory context in several countries, okay? You have to know what is the overview of regulatory requirements in countries for various chemical legislation. Clear regulatory needs for alternative assays. What is the intended use? Is this for replacement? If it's for an alternative? Is this intended to be as for hazard identification or for risk assessment? I think it has, as I mentioned, it has to be broadly available and accessible, the assay. And for this reason, we really encourage early discussions between the methods developers and regulators, so you can anticipate some of the issues that you could have from other stakeholders. Your regulators participate in the expert group, so they are aware of the type of discussions that take place in the development of different test guidelines, so they can already anticipate some of the issues that you might have. Okay, then of course you have to try to reach for scientific acceptance. So as I mentioned, the clarity of the experimental data will be important. You have to say that the positive, negative, challenging chemicals, for example, the clarity of the applicability domain covered. So are there limitations? Is this for PCAM properties, for specific classes of chemicals, only for certain nanomaterials? All that needs to be specified in the SPSF and later on in the development of your documents. Clarity and transparency. So you have to make sure that not only native English speakers can understand the document. It sounds silly, but these documents are used by many, as I mentioned, by many countries, and sometimes the wording used needs to be as straightforward as possible to avoid any misunderstanding there. And as I said, I mean, I think it has to be something that is available in the public domain. So perhaps just to finish, I think some of the points that I would like you to remember is this is about increasing the trust. So when industry come up with a proposal, you can have, the regulator has the trust that the result that you are presenting is reproducible and repeatable, so it's reliable. So they have to be able to evaluate you on that. I really suggest that you contact your national coordinators or regulators in your country that we can, of course, assist you to get in touch with. And it's a list that is public in the OECD public domain. And just to make sure that you have, just to remember that it has to be of easy access for all the different stakeholders that are going to be using your products. So I think I will leave it there because I know that my colleagues will have some other points that I haven't mentioned here, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mar. Perfect timing. If we can take one or two quick questions from Mar, but at the risk of them being answered in the next talks, of course. If there are any. There's none in the chat so far. I think the points about making sure that you build the regulatory acceptance alongside the scientific acceptance is a very useful point to make, because I think some of the bits we've seen, we've tried to get the science to be fully acceptable before we then started addressing some of the political issues, and then it falls over again and you have to go back. So, okay. If there's no other questions, then we'll come back to Mar afterwards. The next talk is by Catherine and Doris from Uber. Perfect, I can see the slides. And I don't know who's going to lead the talk.
So I'm going to present, Klaus.
Okay. Thank you, Doris.
So I hope you can all hear me well, despite my little cold. And thanks for inviting us, for giving this talk. I would like to use the next minutes to introduce you to what Klaus called the customer's needs for OECD test guideline and guidance document development from the perspective and the experiences in leading such a development. So my colleague Catherine, who's on the call today, and I called this presentation Sitting on the Fence. So why are we think that leads are sitting on the fence, and how does this affect our view on needs, but also on challenges and pitfalls for test guideline and guidance document development for nanomaterials? Next slide, please. So you already saw this little triangle in the presentation of Mar, and I would like to use it to somehow explain why we are sitting on this fence. Leading a test guideline puts you somehow in the middle of this little triangle. So leads usually have some scientific background, so they know and understand the scientific details needed for a test guideline or guidance document development, but they're also part of the OECD processes and know which rules you have to follow and what are the important steps and considerations. And finally, leads are very often also involved in regulatory processes and very much would like to use the information which is gained by a new test guideline or a new guidance document for risk assessments, which means that looking at the different tasks we as leads have, either at WPMN or at WNT level, which I list on the right-hand side of this slide, we also, next to this task, have to somehow try to balance the different needs and interests of these people and partners in this triangle. Next slide, please. So this slide is just intends you to give you a short impression on which W&T projects, Germany is currently leading and was leading in the past. And as you can see from that figures, we are mainly involved, or were mainly involved, in activities and projects related to Section 3 of the OECD Test Guideline program, which is on environmental fate and behavior. And the most famous activity maybe is the one which was presented by Frank just a few minutes ago on the development of the test guideline on dispersion stability of nanomaterials in the environment. But we are also involved, currently involved in leading a W&T project of the section on physical properties, which is on particle size and size distribution of nanomaterials. And based on these projects, but also based on cooperation and communications with leads of related OECD projects, we somehow collected some experiences I would like to give to you in the next minutes. Next slide, please. So what are our experiences so far? First of all, I would like to say that from the feedback we received from, for example, national coordinators of W&T, I think we can say that the test guideline and guidance document for nanomaterials so far may serve as a kind of best practice for this cooperation of science, regulation, and OECD. And I think we all agree that this is due to the really good and extensive pre-discussions we have at WPMN level, as just mentioned earlier by Mar. But next to that, what we are facing is a really strong engagement of both academia and industry, but also of regulatory bodies to become involved in the OECD standardization processes. And we see a really high willingness to provide input on a voluntary basis, which means either by providing data or by providing lab experiences or by providing first standard operating protocols, which may serve as a starting point to think about a guidance document or a test guideline. But there's also the high willingness to become a member and to take part in the discussion at the dedicated joint expert groups at W&T and WPMN level. And also we have a high willingness to participate in the commenting rounds by giving scientific comments to the different drafts at different levels, but also to become a lab partner in the inter-laboratory comparison tests for validating draft test guideline. And this actually means a lot of capacities, a lot of personal capacities, but also lab capacities and also monetary capacities. And I would like to use the opportunity to give you some or two examples from what we believe are two good examples for successful and maybe also for inspiring cooperation. And the first one is that scientific core group we had for the development of a new guidance document for nanomaterials, which should support the applicability of the test guideline 312 for nanomaterials. And this 312 is on investigating the leaching of substances in soil columns. And within this core group, members were supporting us with writing different text passages, but we also had a little small interlaboratory comparison to develop this guidance document, which again meant a lot of capacities of the members, and this is really appreciated. And the second example I would like to give to you is a drafting workshop we had with a small number of experts from both science and regulations, and some of them are on the call today, if not most of them. And this drafting workshop was a 2-day workshop where we really sat together and wrote on the draft guidance document, and this really promoted the progress and somehow also revived the progress again to be able to speed up the development of the guidance document 318, which was also already mentioned by Frank. It's the one on the interpretation of data from dispersion stability of nanomaterials and dissolution of nanomaterials in the environment. Next slide, please. However, there also seem to be some pitfalls for a smooth test guideline and guidance document development for nanomaterials. And to overcome these pitfalls from our experiences, there are some prerequisites which should be considered when starting a new activity, but there are also some considerations which are more content related, which should be considered during the test guideline development. And the most obvious prerequisite from our point of view is, of course, to thoroughly consider the guidance of OECD, which is already out there to support you during the different steps on how to develop a test guideline or a guidance document, but also the guidance on validation of test guidelines for international acceptance. And these guidance documents should be considered because they show actually how to do it. In addition to that, what we believe is really important is to understand the regulatory information requirement of the different regions, and also the accepted approaches for certain assessments, to be able to really shape a protocol within your OECD test guideline or in your guidance document, which really addresses the endpoint for which data are needed. And in this context, this is also important, and this was mentioned by Mar as well, to connect to regulator at a very early stage of the development, just to get informed about their needs and their interests, to ensure that the protocol, the document you are developing, is actually in the end applicability for regulation and has a certain significance for regulation. And the other person you should connect to, and this was already mentioned by Mar too, is your national coordinator at WP and WNT at an early stage of your plannings, because this is the person at WNT who can go all the steps together with you and inform you on the important milestones and maybe on the pitfalls you may face. And what we recognized as well, which is what is really important, is to be informed on the test guideline and the guidance documents which are already within the OECD test guideline program, but also to be aware of ongoing projects within the WNT work plan, to identify if there are related activities and if there is maybe some overlap, and just to figure out if it's possible to make synergies, but also to avoid that you're doing double work. Regarding considerations which are more content related during the development of a test guideline or a guidance document, our advice is to really make sure that you are using equipment which is broadly available, because what should be avoided is that monopolies are offered to single sellers due to the selection of a certain material or a certain technique within your document. And finally, what we believe is very important is to concentrate in the endpoint you are interested in, and which should be the target of your document. And this was also already mentioned by Frank, that for sure there will be a lot of scientific details which are interesting beyond the pure test protocol you're providing within this document. But these details may not be easily workable, and they may also not be reproducible and robust, and repeatability, which are actually the features a test guideline should have. And finally, what we believe and think is also important is to avoid to define thresholds and definitions which may be more usable or more appropriate for regulation, because if you introduce such thresholds or definition into your protocols, this might limit the broad applicability at a global scale, which is actually the intention of these OECD documents, as already mentioned by Mar.
Excellent. Sorry, Doris, you're muted for some reason.
Oh, yes, sorry. Sorry. don't know how that happened. Next slide, please. This is just the final slide to give you some main messages, and I think there will be some doubling to what people said before. So our advice would be to engage experts from the Science OECD Regulation Triangle presented in the beginning, which just means that you should make sure that these experts are represented in your expert group, and you may also consider some kind of drafting workshop, as I presented earlier, for example, in case you are identifying conflicting interests or your progress is somehow stagnating for some reasons. This might be a possibility to revive the process again. And our next message would be, as I already said, to get in contact with related projects, but also consider existing OECD test guideline and guidance document, just to strive for maximum harmonization if it is meaningful, but in any case to cooperate, or if the overlap is really strong, to decide to join or even merge activities. And finally, on a regular basis, our recommendation would be to critically review your draft to see if it still features the important features OECD test guideline and guidance document should have, and this is workability. And in terms of a test guideline, it's also robustness, reliability, and repeatability. And I think, next slide, please. This is the final one. So thank you for your attention, and we look forward to the discussions.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Doris. That's brilliant. There's one question already from Sean. Do you want to speak it out yourself, Sean?
Yeah, hi, Doris. You mentioned sort of the willingness of people to provide voluntary support, but I've just got a quick question about how important has the funding from the EU in Framework 7 and Horizon 2020 been in actually giving people the funding to allow them to participate in SOP and data development, and also participate in meetings as well?
So from what we experience is that there is and was a strong engagement of people involved in EU projects. However, of course, the former funding did not include to these kind of engagement. So from our experience, to have a full funding of a whole activity from the beginning, from seeing the scientific need until participating and dealing with, like Frank said, the 44 pages of comments, you need really an exclusive funding, which is covering the whole time and which is exclusive for this activity. So I think that there was a strong engagement of people from these EU projects, for example, in commenting or participating in the validation rounds, in the interlaboratory comparison tests. But for the process, there needs to process of developing the test guideline or a guidance document, there should be a specific own project, maybe not a specific own funding, but a dedicated project.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, we were able to engage quite heavily, but obviously it's only within that 4-year time frame, and we've had to do it across several projects for some of the test guidelines that we've been involved in. That, you know, and you also, Frank's timeline at the start, which started with some national funding and then went across at least 2 EU projects, if not 3, that I've been involved with Frank to get it delivered. I think it's really helpful to see what makes it easier for us to provide, you know, both from Mars checklist and to you, in terms of what we need to provide in terms of understanding not just the science, but also where it fits in. I'm guessing the one question I'd like to get back to after Eric's talk is, how does it work the other way in the triangle? How do the regulators and the OECD push needs out to the scientists for what it is you'll need next? A lot of what we've seen today is scientific ideas that have then been, and how to push them into the OECD. But I can see we got people from ECHA and other places here, so it would be useful for them to think about how can they make the requests either via the OECD, or where's the platform that says these are the ones we need next. But maybe Eric will answer some of that. So thank you very much, Doris. Unless there's any other questions, I'll pass on to Eric. Anybody got burning one for Doris? No? Okay, thank you very much, Doris. Eric, I'll let you share the screen and tell us what it's like in your part of the triangle.
I assume you're seeing my screen now?
Perfect.
Yeah.
In slide blue. Thank you.
Thanks. Not sure whether I can fully answer your question, Klaus, but we can discuss later, I guess. I'm briefly going through, well, the same triangle again, but then looking from the regulatory side. And tasks of the regulator are indicated here, and mainly I think most of those tasks there indicated are WNT related. So really, do we need this test guideline, and what type of regulatory need will it fulfill? And there's several steps in the process, as Mar also indicated in her presentation today, and Frank, of course. I only have a few slides, so what I wanted to do is put up a few observations, and one also mentioned by Mar. OECD is a global organization, and especially for the mutual acceptance of data to work, you need to be aware that there's different jurisdictions which may have potentially at least different regulatory needs, which might make it more difficult to make a overall test guideline workable globally. So that's something to be aware of, probably already at the beginning, at least to some extent, especially when you start writing your test guideline. It helps to have that clear picture, what is needed for, and what are potential differences between the different jurisdictions. And another point is that these test guidelines and guidance documents are broadly applicable. In principle, test guidelines are applicable for all chemicals. Clearly, the nanomaterials have other properties that may require some additional tweaking of test guidelines, or maybe even separate test guidelines, but in principle for all chemicals. So also keep that in mind. If you start writing something for nanomaterials, you might already start also to think about, is it maybe applicable for particles in general and not necessarily only on the nanoscale. So that might also make it broader applicable than maybe thought of from the beginning. And where it's not broadly applicable, as Mar also mentioned, it's definitely needed that you write down in the test guideline what the applicability domain is. If it's only to a certain type of materials, only metals, for instance, or only nanomaterials, that should be clearly indicated there. I think this next point on the necessary equipment, already mentioned also by both Mar and Doris. Well, apart from you shouldn't be depending on one manufacturer or one lab, it should also preferably be globally available and maybe even more important, affordable. If it's even if it's available globally, if it's gonna have to cost thousands of euros for each test to do something, that's probably not always applicable, especially not thinking of physicochemical testing, for instance. And then also a good SOP is not necessarily a good test guideline, because that's a test guideline requires different things than a step-by-step approach of how to do the tests. And what works in one lab as SLP does not necessarily work in another lab. So a test guideline is sometimes less prescriptive than you would expect. For instance, for certain media used in a test, test guidelines might provide several options that you could use simply because certain media are available in one part of the world and not in another part. So those are also some things that might differ and might be considered from the start. An SLP is a good starting point usually, as I think Doris also mentioned, but you need to have something more than that. And then also something that Mar mentioned already was well, I call it here OECD language, but it's definitely more than proper English. There can be global differences in interpretation of an English text, and you should be aware of that. Usually that comes out in commenting rounds, and you can sometimes easily solve things, especially if you get a clear suggestion of how people would like or what people would like to read. Sometimes it's more difficult because it's sometimes not easy to understand why someone reads something in a certain language. And of course, there's usually some terminology definitions involved. Most of the test guidelines have a list of that, but clearly it's helpful to have the same definition in different test guidelines when it's considering the same property. So looking at different test guidelines that are out there for definitions and making sure that you use the same terminology is helpful. That in all steps of the way, I would say. And that brings me under the same headings to some of the main messages. To ensure that you get the global that you get the global views, it's useful to include experts from across the globe. And as Mar indicated, she can help you in engaging with other areas of the globe that may be farther away from you. And the same is true for round robin testing. That also helps if you have a global representation, so you can easily spot where difficulties may arise when you need certain equipment or certain media that might be more difficult to get by in other areas. And on the clarity of OECD test guidelines, again, a clear description of the applicability domain, and related to that, also ensure that you have a sufficient number and variety of materials in round robin, because that helps you to clarify, or at least to some extent also prove that your test guideline is applicable for a broader range of materials. And the description, how it can be used in a risk assessment, it's important in the SPSF, as Mar already indicated, but I think it's also important that the test guidelines clearly indicate how certain test outcomes or can be used in a risk assessment. So describing that in your test guideline will also be useful. On the language, make it clear, avoid jargon as far as possible, but where it's not possible to avoid, then at least make sure that you have a proper definition of it. And that definition and terminology should be preferably based on what is out there already. And also a clear description of reporting requirements is something that that is needed at least to quickly. A regulator usually wants to have a quick tick list of seeing things, whether it's good or not, and if things are not reported, then that can easily be spotted. That's useful for them. And also to keep in mind, especially in the later commenting rounds, especially the test guidelines, as they are related to the mutual acceptance of data and thus to the regulatory acceptance of data. WNT needs to be anonymous in approving a test guideline. So if you see in your commenting rounds really strong objections against certain areas or certain things in your test guideline, make sure that you streamline that before a WNT starts to decide on a test guideline, because it's very likely if you don't smooth it out before, then the test guideline will not be accepted and you'll easily lose another year before the WNT have his other meeting and can discuss again. I think this was my last one. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Eric. Really quite useful to see how important the detailed, maybe non-scientific language can become here in the end in terms of reaching that acceptance across so many different regulatory entities. Is it often the case that a regulator will have a guideline that they know for a certain evidence requirement, and when a new one comes up that might be better on some aspects, they're unwilling to take that on just because it would make it difficult for them to fit it in? Or is it usually always that sort of the unacceptance is based on a scientific criteria of it doesn't deliver what we need it to, if that question makes sense?
I'm trying to see if it makes sense.
I could, as a scientist, it would be possible to deal with, it doesn't measure this in sufficient accuracy or whatever, but in other cases, we might be suggesting something in one regulatory area like REACH that doesn't really fit with Northern American regulation because you just consider wildlife in a slightly different manner. If it's those sorts of issues, where do they prop up? Do they only pop up at the end at the WNT meetings because they can't accept the guideline, or would people be upfront enough that they just don't accept the SPSF at the first time?
Depending a bit on how it is described in the SPSF, of course, it can pop up there already. What also helps is to ensure in your expert groups that are also accompanying the test guideline developments, make sure that you have several jurisdictions on board, and not only the scientists of that jurisdictions, but also some people that actually have to interpret and use the data that come out of it will be very helpful there, I guess. And if even you don't get it there, then I'm pretty sure it will come up in the commenting rounds, which usually have one or two near the, that's usually near the end. So, but it's something to be aware of that can pop up.
And is that something as the national contact point for lead that person would pick up, knowing the regulatory field much better than scientists, I presume, given it as a team?
Yeah, that I assume that the national coordinator will pick up on certain things, like, okay, this might work for REACH, but we've seen examples that it doesn't work in the US. So make sure that you get them on board, or at least discuss with them how to accommodate that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Any other specific questions for Eric? Otherwise, we'll go back to the Mentimeter and see what results we got for the last bit. I can't see anything in the chat. Okay, put us out of our mystery then, Sean. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, for those who haven't been on the call earlier, we have been using Mentimeter at the first part of the meeting. There's still one more question to answer, which is coming up, but we just got some results from the previous ones to show. So out of a population of 30, based on your own experiences, half the people think that the test guideline process is slightly too slow. Oh, it's adjusted because somebody's just, just on.
Okay, well, that's interesting. It'll be, there's an interesting point in what it is that could be faster, I suppose.
And the next question, which is a range of statements, was that we have broad agreements that people understand the way that test guidelines are developed. The one that's sort of interesting is test guidelines are not vital to everybody's daily work, but people understand the role that obviously play in regulatory requirements. And maybe the slightly worrying one is people knowing how to contact the relevant actors to provide feedback on proposed new test guidelines.
Yeah.
And then just coming on to the last question for those. So this is for everybody. This one hasn't been answered at all yet. And this is just a range of statements, again, for various levels of from disagree to agree. And it's more around the sort of more feedback really for us on how useful the meeting was. So I'll leave this one running so people can address this whilst you continue with the discussion, Klaus.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. I guess you can hide the slide so we can see people that would wish to ask a question. I think based on the, where did my chat go? That's my chat. Where's the chat go? There. There's nothing in the chat as such, but given quite a lot of us said it was, oh, just said what I said, didn't I? Some of us, many of us, half of us, said it was slightly slower than it could or should be. Does anybody have a comment on what element they believe could be faster or should be faster? I think one of my struggles is that it's such a set calendar that if you miss one bit, you kind of move on to another year. And I don't know how many times that happens in your experience, that something that was nearly ready kind of gets bumped another year. Just for lack of preparation.
I got one. No, I think, yeah, I think the question about how long it takes for a test guidelines, for me, it's a little bit difficult to answer because there, as Frank mentioned, there is a whole work that is done before you have a proposal at the OECD. So the more information you have before you go to OECD, the faster it will go at our end. Yeah. The trouble is when, as I said, I mean, the science is not mature enough, and when you confuse doing a test guidelines with like a research project at our end, then hell break loose, and then it's extremely complicated to move on because the SPSF was not clear enough, because then people don't know what type of guidance they are supposed to provide to the documents that you have put forward. And I think that we had that experience, and I think that's something that needs to be said with the very early, some of the very early proposals that we made, because we lack experience from the nano world, expert world, to the WNT, and I think that has improved a lot. And something to come back also to the question from Sean about the H2020 projects, that this is increasing, the experience is increasing and it's improving. It's true that one of the things that I would like to mention is within the WPMN and the WNT are two different groups that works on a very different manner. So the WPMN will allow you to have somewhat more flexibility because it's more like a counselor, if you want. It's not a decision body for the test guideline. So it will allow you to stay and to continue the discussion within the frame of OECD for as long as you need to have it. The WNT, indeed, once you submit, you have a very specific deadline. So if you don't submit your project proposal by the 15th November, there's no way you can discuss that in April the following year. And if you didn't submit the last draft or your test guidelines or your guidance document by the 10th of March, there's no way this is going to be submitted for that year. You have to wait a whole year. So I think these are two different processes that I would like to mention here. So I think there are ways to make it faster, but if you don't follow this checklist, let's say, and the advice that have been provided by my colleagues on the talks today, it's very easy to make it very long and painful as a process.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Anybody else wants to comment on what they think could be faster or smoother, whether that's something you've experienced being slow or it's something you believe should just move faster, even if we don't know quite how we would ever make it move faster? Okay. Eric, do you have a comment or?
Yeah, I think I can add at least something. It's not sure how much faster it will become in the end, but I think what came to mind was the example that Doris gave, that for the guidance on dissolution and dispersion, at one point it seemed to be more or less stuck, and to get that forward, having that writing session in Berlin really helped to bring the process up to speed again, and that those type of things might help as well. And I think clearly starting to write already, even if you're not fully clear on the details, might also help to speed up a few things.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I mean, from the experience of that writing session, the thing that I think was really helpful was that we had all the actors in the room at the same time. So you didn't write it down and then email it across and then got comments back two different ways from two different people. If somebody disagreed, you could have the discussion there and then and go, oh, now I understand why you disagree. And in that case, my answer is this, which is then more, which just flowed much faster. So maybe it can't be faster, but some of the bits could definitely be made smoother, I guess, which is kind of the purpose of NanoHarmony and Mars NanoMet project, in terms of how do we, you know, the process takes some time. It takes a good long time to get the science mature, and then if it is mature and acceptable, then it can pass through WNT pretty quick. But if you go into WNT, as Mars says, with something that's slightly too loose, you do lose a year at a time. It's not a process of, oh, I'll come back next month. You're coming back next year. So, okay. Mar?
Yeah, no, just to mention something for those that are not very familiar. So a test guideline and a guidance documents are different. So the test guidelines, it's legally binding by OECD countries, and you need a validation and round robin test, etc. So it's much more cumbersome. So my only advice, if when possible, and when you see that there are existing test guidelines addressing some of your concerns, see whether there is the development of a guidance document, which is really a supporting document for the test guidelines on, okay, if you have these nanomaterials or if you have this substance, then be careful about ABC, because that is going to be faster. So I think that's something that just to keep in mind, that you have two options here in moving forward. It's not only test guidelines, but you could also move forward with a guidance document, and that should go faster.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. I know we're at time, but Amaya, I saw you pop up, so I'm imagining you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Klaus. Yeah, thank you for these very good presentations and this very nice discussion. I just want to, sorry. I just want to bring back again the need to have a transparent exchange between not only between scientists, but also with regulators, so that we are all aware that what are the needs from all of the sides when developing it, so it can actually go faster. In my view, maybe some of the things that have actually slowed down the process is that there hasn't been a transparent exchange from the very beginning. So when the things were going to be taken into publishing, then it's when the whole group realized, the working group realized this is still not ready to go. And then that would be, I think, a very good advice, communication from the very, very beginning with all relevant parties.
And that communication presumably through the expert group and making sure that expert group is wide enough, so it's not just technical experts, but also application experts, if you want, the people that actually have to use it on all sides of the triangle.
Yeah, and also, I don't know, something else I would like to share, and I don't know that much because I actually never applied to any EU fundings, but I know that one of the main elements there for the EU fund is that some time ago they were for development of OECD standard test guidelines, and that was the main thing. So I think it's good also to keep in mind. I know I have been a researcher, and I have been also like a free will. I like doing what I want and find out the answers to my own questions, but to keep in mind what the actual goal of the whole project is. I think that's really important to keep in mind while we are doing it, so that all the findings or most of the findings can actually be applicable to take out an OECD standard guidance at the end. That is also something that it could be good to have in mind.
Thank you. And I think that comes back to one of the points Doris made, that there's funding for the science, but then there's a lack of funding for driving that down to the specific reduction in science, which Frank described, which isn't easy to get funding for. I want to take my science and make it so simple that I throw half the science out. It's not many science organizations that fund that element of the work. So that's usually been the hard bit. Catherine, I can see you up there. Thank you, Amaya.
Yeah, thank you. I also just want to bring in some experience we had during the test guideline development. It's about if you're running in circles about a point of discussion and you don't find an agreement on this, because there's even no agreement outside in the world, like for a certain definition or threshold, you might try to find an alternative solution to avoid to use, let's say, a certain definition or something like this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you run in circles for years.
Yeah. And I think if you're running in circles for a little while, there's usually a reason for it. And it's in an international world, it is one of those things that Eric said, one word means a lot of things if you go around. And if two people will disagree on it fundamentally, then you got to pick another word rather than decide on which of those two. Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we go back and see the results to our last slides to see whether we improved the knowledge today or not? Doesn't seem to be like that. Thank you very much then for everybody's input. Sean, do you want to just show us the last results?
Yep, so these are the final results. Low population, only 15 people answered, but there seems to be verging on agreement that most people feel they've at least learned something new. Maybe the one to look at is there seems to be in the middle on, I believe it should still be possible to move new science into OECD test guideline approval faster.
Okay. Well, it's very much around the neutral bits. So But the distributions behind show quite interesting, I think. Some of them are slightly bimodal. So, okay. Good. Well, I'm glad most people slightly agreed that they learned something new today. It's good that there's also some that were neutral, which showed that there were the people that thought they knew a lot, which there were half of the people actually did know it, so they didn't learn something new. I'm hoping that's how it's working out, and it wasn't all the people that thought they knew that learned a lot. Okay. So with that, I think, given time, I'd like to just move on to the next slide. Presumably that's the advertisement for the next network meeting, which is a meeting that will be held. We're not going to have any further workshops over the summer and early fall. We're going to go straight to November, where we have a big 2 or 3 day meeting. So 2 half days, either side of a whole day probably, to update on the TG developments in NanoHarmony and the related projects. And that also links to the NanoMet project of Mars and what goes on in there. So you can sign up on the NanoHarmony website, like always. It'll be about both the updates on the actual test guidelines that are being developed within NanoHarmony. But as you can see on the posted note, there's also going to be 2 specific stakeholder sessions, one for regulators, looking at how the TGs for regulatory developments are being put through, and one for industry, looking at which TGs are used in regulatory dossiers and are there ones that we think we need. It was one of the questions we didn't get back to was how do we feed the needs of new test guidelines into the OECD faster, or out to scientists so they can, as Amaya said, develop the right things during the research phase. So that will be the next time we meet in a NanoHarmony regime. But until then, obviously there'll be meetings of the expert groups for each of the test guidelines that are being developed within NanoHarmony on an ad hoc basis when they need them. And unless there's any other comments from anybody, I'd like to close the meeting there, but I will give people 30 seconds or less probably. No? Nothing? Excellent. Thank you very much for today, and sorry to overrun by 10 minutes. And we'll see you in November. Thank you very much.